For decades, the history of the DC Universe has been marked by its crisis-level events, status quo-altering storylines that have rewritten continuity while also providing a meta-commentary on DC Comics publishing itself, and all under a signature red glow. This is Red Skies, a 13-part podcast epic mining these events and the Superman of it all. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This is Red Skies, Chapter 4, and joining me in studio to discuss Identity Crisis by Brad Meltzer and Rags Morales, returning guest, sweet Bernie Gerstmayr.
I will tell you, it is surreal that we're looking directly at each other. Usually it's a look on the left side of the screen, and now it's like, hey, buddy.
This is great. You and I had met. The first time we met was in person at Aw Yeah Comics, Harrison.
Yep.
Years ago now.
Yeah. Pre-pandemic, I think my daughter was talking about getting into film, and then you happened to be in the store, and it was crazy.
Yeah, and then I think it was you who sent me a friend request on Facebook.
Yes.
And we kept in touch that way. And then when I started up the Superman show, I reached out to you. We had an off-mic chat just to kind of get a sense of your Superman fan journey. And then as the audience knows at this point, you've been one of our most frequent guests. But yes, always virtually, but you're in town on the East Coast visiting family, and we were able to work this out. So yeah, we're both here in Flat Squirrel Studios. It's awesome. Very exciting, very different.
I love it. It's a great studio. It's a great room.
And we are here to discuss the ever-controversial Identity Crisis. There's a lot to unpack here. I recognize people have strong feelings about this work in both directions.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you're here. I know we'll have a rational, even-handed discussion about this and kind of take the work as it is and wrestle with it a little bit.
Yeah.
And just to kind of lay out what we've read, certainly, of course, we read the main 7-issue miniseries, 2004, 2005, Brad Meltzer, Rags Morales, Michael Baer, Alex Sinclair, Ken Lopez. I listed the whole creative team, which I rarely do, but there were so many different components to, I think, what makes this book what it is. Mm-hmm. Additionally, we read Crisis of Conscience, which was the 5-part arc in JLA by Geoff Johns, Allan Heinberg, and Chris Batista. That was the follow-up to this and somewhat of a bridge between Identity Crisis and Infinite Crisis.
Right.
We also took a look all the way back into the Bronze Age at Justice League of America 166 through 168, which was the original story where the secret society of supervillains switched bodies with the Justice League, which of course is referenced in Identity Crisis and comes back into play in an even bigger way in Crisis of Conscience. So it was interesting to kind of look at all three of those stories and this larger arc that they're telling. I did also take a look at some of the other tie-ins to Identity Crisis.
Okay.
The Secret of Barry Allen in The Flash, for example, the autopsy issue from JSA. There were also a couple of arcs in Teen Titans and Green Arrow that dealt with Dr. Light. I did not revisit those, but I did look at some of the other ones. So I'll kind of sprinkle those in here and there as we go. So again, there's a lot to unpack in terms of why this is controversial, what it's all about in the first place, and how it fits into this event that we're doing here on the DC Crisis events. But as always, I want to start on the personal front here, and I want to toss it to you and just ask, what has your relationship with this work been from when it initially came out through any subsequent readings over the years to this reread now? How has your relationship with this work evolved?
I remember reading it when it came out. I bought it when it came out. I saw Brad Meltzer's name on it. I was like, oh, this is a best-selling author, something different. Picked it up, read it, was intrigued by it. It was hard. It was the first, I want to say it was like the first real hard DC book that I read. You know, I read Crisis. It wasn't, what I mean by that is it was a hard, real, rough topical book for DC to write. Didn't read it again until the trade came out, and then haven't read it since for various reasons, which we can talk about too. But I would say that I left the first 2 reads wow, that's a pretty rough story. Didn't know how I felt about it. Kind of wrestling with really the morality of numbers of things in the book, from how the heroes are dealing with it and how Ralph is dealing with it and all that. But now I feel kind of it's different having two teenage and adult daughters reading a book like this. Like, okay, how would I feel about this from a dad's point of view?
I totally get that. Actually, one of the things I was going to ask you is, have your daughters read it?
No.
Would you, I don't want to say would you let them, they can decide,
sure, yeah.
but would you steer them towards it? Would you steer them away from it? Would you just sort of preface it before they read it? How would you approach that?
I don't think I'd recommend it. And actually, I wouldn't recommend it not because of the topic, but because of how, whether it's Meltzer or the editorial, how they represented women in the books. There's a unnecessary damsel in distress, weak woman representation in this book. And even how women treat other women was also concerning to me. And that would be, I think, the biggest reason I'm not going to recommend it. If they want to read it, Belle might get, see oh, this is interesting. She might want to read it, but I'm not being like, hey, you know what you should do? No, I'm not going to. There's better books that represent women in DC right now. So
I hear you. So let's not dance around it. So again, I would imagine people listening to this are familiar with the plot, but I'll just give the basic overview here. So Sue Dibney, the wife of the elongated man, ones of DC heroes are targeted as well. And after Sue's funeral, a subset of the satellite era Justice League team assemble, and they go on the hunt for Dr. Light, who they are convinced is the one responsible for Sue's death.
Which you don't know why yet.
You don't know why, but Wally and Kyle, the newbies, the new generation heroes,
right,
and the audience soon come to learn that years ago, Dr. Light had boarded the Justice League satellite, found Sue there by herself, attacked and raped her, and was then apprehended by the Justice League, who voted not only to erase his memory of those events, but to alter his personality, to use Zatanna's abilities to, as they put it in the book, magically lobotomize him.
Mm-hmm.
We learn even later in the story that things took yet another turn when Batman interrupted them, and the League voted unanimously this time. They were split on the lobotomy. They were unanimous in deciding to erase 10 minutes from Batman's memory. And there's a lot more, and we'll reference other events, but those are really the broad strokes of the story. So it's a murder mystery set within the DC universe that really casts the heroes and this Bronze Age history in particular in this new light.
And it's bringing to light, too, what kind of secrets they may or may not hold from each other. And it's not just about secret identities, it's about literal secrets and how they can damage, how they can help, how they can hurt, and really where do we as readers fall on the side of the secret.
Yes, very much so. I asked you your experience with this. I'll share mine. So, and I don't want to bury the lead as far as where I land on this book.
Sure.
I'll get to that. So I'm not going to bury the lead, but I'll get to that. So I guess I will bury the lead a little bit, but this came out when I was a senior in high school. This was part of what I sort of refer to as my golden age as a comic book reader. Yes, I read all through the Triangle era in the 90s, but I was only reading the Superman books at the time, and I was a little kid. That period from, again, I want to say 2000, around when Jeff Loeb and Joe Kelly took over the Superman books, through Infinite Crisis, so early to mid-aughts, was really the sweet spot for me because those were my high school and early college years. So I was a little bit older. I was appreciating things on a little bit of a more sophisticated level. I was working at my local comic shop, so I was surrounded by all of this stuff. I had more thrown around money, so I could buy whatever I wanted. And I was talking to people about all of this stuff. And as much as, yes, there's a lot of nostalgia here, I mean, honestly, I feel like objectively there were a lot of great runs that were happening at that time.
Yeah. The JLA run was happening at that time, too.
Yeah, the JLA stuff, the JSA revival, Geoff Johns on Flash, the Green Lantern Rebirth, Gotham Central. My goodness. Again, the Loeb Kelly stuff on the Superman books. And I know I rarely ever talk about Marvel, but over on the Marvel side, you had Bendis doing Ultimate Spider-Man, Daredevil, Alias.
Yeah.
I was also getting
Ultimates.
Ultimate, yeah.
Mark Millar stuff, yeah.
So for me, this was a very special time. And this book in particular, I think, hit at just the right spot for me. And I was as a senior in high school reading this, I was engrossed by it. Yeah. Obviously, there are aspects of it that were unsettling, to put it mildly, to read then, and remain so, and even more so now as a married father at this point, of course.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, again, in terms of how it looked at this community of DC heroes and villains, and really made the DC universe feel like this real lived-in world in terms of how the heroes and the villains regarded each other. That stood out to me, and it just felt like this was, again, a different kind of story, and I enjoyed it. Again, in that initial read, I still remember leaving school during my lunch period the day issue 7 came out.
Oh.
So I went to an all-boys Catholic high school, very strict. Only seniors were even allowed to leave campus.
Yeah.
And I remember the day it came out. I was working at the shop, but this was, I was working there like after school and summers and stuff like that. I didn't have a key yet. And I remember I knocked on the door, and for anyone who has listened to my other podcasts about the owner of my old comic shop, he didn't like that, even from those of us who worked there. So, but he let me in, and he let me buy my copy early. And I remember sitting there in the car and reading that 7th issue and feeling like, oh, okay. It was a letdown. I remember being let down by it. I had a similar experience with Hush. I did the exact same thing. I went there during my lunch period and sat in the car and read it. And in both instances, I've revisited both of these works over the years and still kind of feel the same way about the ending, feeling a little bit let down as far as the ultimate resolution to the mystery. But overall, despite the ugly parts of it, I still looked at it as something that I enjoyed, and that, again, just took as you said, took a harder look at these characters and what they're all about. I haven't reread it a ton over the years. I mean, I don't know, once or twice before now. It's not something
you go back to like, ooh, like it's dark. Like that's not a topic like, let me go reread the series where they have a villain rape a character. That's not.
Yeah,
you shouldn't.
Yeah, it's not a light read. You're like, I'm just gonna grab this off the shelf and I'll read it. It's like, you really have to, honestly, steel yourself for this, because in the few times that I have reread it, including this time, when you get to issue 2 and you know that flashback is coming, it's like, God damn it. And you really have to brace yourself.
There's incredible scenes in this series we should talk about, but when you know that that's a scene, you're like, oh, where is it? And then it is done tastefully, I feel, but it's pretty clear. It's pretty rough.
Yes. So, over the years, that aside, and despite my disappointment with the ultimate resolution of who the perpetrator is, which, again, spoiler alert, but Jean Loring, the ex-wife of the Atom, is revealed to be the person responsible. Despite misgivings with respect to those aspects, I still enjoyed it, like I said, for making the DC Universe feel like this lived-in place, and this pantheon of heroes really felt like a community of people who worked together.
Right. And
in terms of these ethical questions that the book poses, and I know people's mileage on this may vary, and there's more I want to talk about and ask you with respect to that, but I thought they were valid questions to ask, and certainly DC got a lot of material out of it, maybe too much so, and that's something else we can talk about in terms of how this paved the road for Infinite Crisis. And I do feel like at a certain point, they overdid it in terms of the characterization of Dr. Light and subsequent storylines, in terms of this overuse of the mind wipe reveal with Catwoman in particular. That's one glaring example that really stands out. But again, overall, I still kind of held this up as a book that I enjoyed. And I had loved, and still do, The Archer's Quest from Brad Meltzer on Green Arrow. Wonderful story. In recent years, and in leading up to reading it for this recording, I've come to see it feels like, as controversial as it was at the time, it really feels like it swung, the public opinion on it has swung even more so, where, when we say it's controversial, it really is. I mean, you search for it on Google, you'll find any number of think pieces on it, and how misogynistic it is and how much it gets wrong and this and that. And one thing that is important to me, and this is probably the law school background, is whether or not I agree with an argument, I want to study it and I want to understand it.
Sure.
And that was kind of the thing going into this, where I said, I don't know exactly where I'm going to land, but I want to understand what problem people have with it exactly and why. And again, it had been so long since I read it, so I was just going off of memory, and I'm seeing these articles and I'm seeing these tweets and all this stuff. I'm like, all right, what's really going on here? So this is the point in the proceedings where 2 straight white men explain the women in refrigerators argument. Yeah, but bear with us here, folks. We'll do our best and treat it with the respect that it deserves. So I think people are aware of this term, women in refrigerators, coined by Gail Simone before she became a comic book writer.
Yep.
And derived from the scene in the Kyle Rayner Green Lantern series where Kyle's girlfriend, Alex DeWitt, is killed and stuffed in a refrigerator by the villain Major Force. Did you read
mind
that?
Mind you, it is like 2 issues into Kyle being Green Lantern.
Yeah.
I read it. I read it right when it came out, and
Yeah.
and that just because I had to turn that page back. Like, wait, did they seriously just stuff her in it? Like, did he kill her? That was hard. That's a big deal because I don't know if anything had been done like that, really, in that way.
Yeah, I mean that really definitely stood out, and it gave birth to this term, this argument, this movement, right? And when we refer to women in refrigerators, and look, I'm going to explain it as best as I understand it, and if there's a nuance that I haven't captured, I apologize. But the use or overuse of violence against women, physical violence, sexual violence, humiliation, murder, overuse of violence against women in these stories and comics. Of course, it extends to other media.
As a glorified trope or plot point.
Right. As a plot point in furtherance of the male protagonist's story, right? So that's the key point. And I think that's an aspect of it that I understand, I grasp more fully now after the recent reading that I've done. This notion that it's particularly egregious when the story doesn't explore how it affects the woman in question, right? It's only about how it moves the male character story along, right?
It is the only thing I have a hard time with Tom Taylor's Injustice. I love that series, but spoilers, the crux of that series is what turns Superman is that the Joker has Superman accidentally kill his own wife, and she's pregnant with a son. So, like, perfect example of how, like, let's do this and see what happens. And it's used as a means to an end, which really frustrates me.
Well, that's a perfect way of putting it, as a means to an end. I think, over the years, this was never something that I was looking to pick apart. I want to be clear here.
Yeah.
But if there was anything I bumped up against, I guess I always looked at what seemed to me to be the larger problem, that so many stories are just told from the perspective of a male protagonist.
Right.
And my again, argument is too strong a word, but my feeling was always like, well, it just so happens that there's so much more violence towards female characters because so many more stories are told from the perspective of the men.
Right.
That is its own problem.
Yeah.
But there was an article that I read, and I don't have the title or the site top of mind, but with respect to Identity Crisis, that actually kind of illuminated this for me, and I got it in a way that I really hadn't before. When you look at Identity Crisis in particular, another victim in the story is Jack Drake, father of Tim Drake, Robin. And he and Captain Boomerang kill each other in mutual combat. Mm-hmm. But as Jack Drake is dying, he's having this conversation with Tim, and they're having this tearful goodbye, and Jack has agency over the proceedings here. He's holding his ground. He's contending with Captain Boomerang. He's not just taken out and then it's all about what happens to Tim. He has that moment. Mm-hmm. And when I kind of thought about it in that context, I said, okay, I get it. You can see a delineation between how a character like Jack Drake went out versus Sue Dibney in the story. So there's that piece of it. When we talk about this, again, it's not just with Sue, the problem or the issue is compounded by the fact that it's the reveal of this rape in the past as well as her brutal murder in the present. So this is a character who is really put through the ringer, and it only ever seems to be for the purpose of seeing how, not even how her husband reacts, but just how the rest of these characters do.
And it was hard too because we did it to a character that wasn't really well known to begin with. Elongated Man, we knew about, not an A character. Sue Dibney, kind of learn about more as we're killing her. Like we learn all about how their romance and love affair is, and then we kill her, or we kill her first and then explain it. It just, again, it seems like a plot point, and not important. It's just a way to get to the crux of the title.
Right. Now, in terms of where I ultimately land on this, So at this point, in talking about the arguments against identity crisis, perhaps I've lost those who just absolutely love it. Now I'll alienate the people who hate it. No, maybe that's the takeaway here. No, like I said, I want to, my feeling is we have to kind of take this as it is. So where I ultimately land on this is, I don't think you can look at this and say there's nothing problematic about it. I mean, you can. I don't think it's a strong argument. Yeah. However, for me, and I know people can and will and do have different answers to this. To me, that doesn't invalidate the entire work.
Correct.
So again, if there's someone who's like, I can't stomach this book, I never want to look at it again, totally get it. If there's someone who's like, again, the book's reliance on this trope that we've been talking about renders it invalid in my book as far as I'm concerned. I understand that too, and that's fine. Yeah. Again, where I land on it is, again, I think there's still enough here of value that's worth talking about that I do still enjoy, but I don't think you can ignore what's going on. And this is whether we're talking real world politics or stories here. I feel like acknowledging, addressing, having an honest discussion is the best way to do it. And so it's like, and we see this, again, I don't want to get too political here, but we see the extremes all the time where on the one hand, you might have people who just refuse to acknowledge any sort of issue or problem, kind of bury their heads in the sand. Then on the other hand, you have people who, again, when we talk about cancel culture, right? Yeah. Like, oh, because of this, well, that's it. That person's done. That project's done. This thing can't be looked at. This thing can't be talked about.
Right.
I don't think that's the answer either. It's like we have to talk about it. We have to wrestle with it. And everyone will land where they land, and that's okay. So that's my feeling.
We talk about this a lot in my house lately, whether you attribute it to Walt Whitman or to Ted Lasso. The "be curious, not judgmental" quote comes into play in so many things. The curiosity of the discussion is important for our culture right now. We are in a society where it's, oh, that one thing, I don't like it, judgment, and it's done. And it doesn't even allow the let's sit in a room and talk. Let's sit around a table, break bread, not read text tone or email tone or article tone, but actually have, well, what about? I haven't thought about. Let's talk about. And be, I hate the like agree to disagree phrase, but you're allowed to disagree if you listen to more perspectives.
Yes.
You're not allowed to disagree if you shut the door. That's not allowed. And that's how our social media culture is. That's how our news culture is. It's black and white. We don't talk about how we arrive at both of those sides. And that's where we get in the danger with a book like this. And I would hate for someone to start with, for example, a Justice League run and then go, whoa, identity crisis, and they just jump. Because I think that's dangerous with the stories of the characters. I think it's important. I don't think we avoid topics. We deal this with music too. You know, I've had friends of mine like, I can't listen to Michael Jackson music anymore. Well, can you separate the artist from the person? Like, can you separate the topic from the rest of this artwork? Identity Crisis is a really cool project. And if you look at, Rags Morales, it's beautiful. It's different than we're used to also. We don't see the Justice League drawn in this way very often, but it's incredible. So I'll stop. It's a run-on sentence.
No, I appreciate all of that. I think it's true. And again, I'm sure we'll get a range of reactions to this, but that's fine, right? Everyone will feel differently about it. The other thing too that is worth mentioning here is this book is almost 20 years old.
Yeah.
And that's not to make an excuse for it, but I would imagine, how should I put this? I did imagine before I read a relatively recent interview with Brad Meltzer, which I'll refer to.
Oh, interesting.
That this probably would have played out differently today. I'll share a quote from an interview he gave where I don't know that it necessarily would. But before I read that interview, I said to myself, well, I'm sure if he were telling this story today, it would be a little different. The other thing too is what I recognize, and we have to also be honest with ourselves about ourselves and our own blind spots. Me reading this as a high school senior, I'm not looking at it from the perspective of, did the female character have enough agency in this story where this violence against her is used as a plot point? No. And it's not right or wrong that I didn't. It was just that wasn't where my head was at the time. And it's like now, in terms of where I am in my life, in terms of what the larger cultural dialogue
Yeah.
has been. It's like, of course you look at this differently. And again, not in a judgmental way, but just in a realistic way about what it is.
I get frustrated when people go, oh, in 2023, like in 2022, rape wasn't bad. Like we use this. Oh, if this was written in 2023, like guys, it's just a bad topic all the time in 1970s, in 1990s. It's something that we should still talk about, but we have this weird like right now we would never do that. I'm like, well then did we not talk about it? Were we in agreement with it 10 years ago? And so some quick facts.
Yes.
Identity Crisis was one of the top-selling books of the entire decade from 2000 to 2010. One of the most popular books, like best-selling, regularly makes a list of DC Comics, best moments, best fights. But it is criticized for its use of sexual violence as a plot device. That's just bare bones facts. So if we go to the, like, is it in the best column? Like, we are going to talk about that tonight. And there are a lot of, like, the Deathstroke fight is incredible. Like, and there's things I want to talk about that side too, that we need to talk about, not just Deathstroke, but what if they told Deathstroke and fill in the blank? How would that have gone down? If Deathstroke knew what Dr. Light did, having a daughter named Rose, how would that have gone down?
Oh, that's a great question.
Like, would he turn around and beat the living crap out of Dr. Light himself? Because that's the thing. He's a mercenary, but he's also a father. He was also a husband, a loving husband. So it's just really interesting how they ignored that a little bit. But stuff we can talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to save this for later, but let's just address it now.
Yeah.
So we were talking off mic about this, but
Yeah.
I was digging a little bit into how this project came to be, because I realized I had a certain assumption based on limited information, and it turned out to be very incomplete. So as we know, Brad Meltzer, of course, is acclaimed New York Times bestselling novelist. And Bob Schreck, editor of Green Arrow, had tapped him to take over that title when Kevin Smith left. And the idea was, we just had this renowned filmmaker from outside the comics field. Now we kind of want to, now we're going to bring in an author and that whole thing. And obviously that did well. My understanding, and this part was true, is that after the success of Archer's Quest, DC wanted more from Meltzer. At this point, this is where my knowledge went astray, because I thought or assumed that Meltzer said, okay, you want more? This is the story I want to tell, and that he generated this. Right. So I was digging around to try to find confirmation on that. And so I found articles and old tweets and screenshots and stuff from Valerie Durazio, who was the assistant editor on the book. Now, there's a whole other separate conversation to be had some other time by someone else.
Yeah.
But as I say that name, that might be familiar. She has written online about her experience working under Mike Carlin, right, renowned editor who recently retired from DC Comics, and she's documented inappropriate workplace behavior and sexual harassment, and that's all out there if people want to read that. But what caught my attention in the context of preparing for this episode specifically is that she talked about how this project was conceived. And in screenshots of old tweets of hers, she said, this book was originally conceived at a DC Comics editor's retreat.
Wow.
As an overall push to make the publisher more dark and edgy as to compete with Marvel Comics. VP Dan DiDio specifically said at the retreat that his goal was to take the smile out of comics.
Wow.
It was supposed to be a statement on DC's new direction, and part of that new direction would be more adult themes such as rape and greater violence. There's an older blog post of hers. The title of it is, quote, "We Need a Rape." So there's that piece of this. She continues, Identity Crisis writer Brad Meltzer got some criticism over the rape scene in the book and its level of violence overall, but to be fair to him, he was specifically asked by editorial to put that in. He didn't come up with those ideas. Sue was chosen as both the rape and murder victim because she was pure and the girl next door. Also, Elongated Man was considered corny, and so having his wife Sue be the victim darkened him a bit. She also addresses, these were much more recent tweets where this came up again. And this was, someone asked about the reveal of Jean Loring as the ultimate perpetrator. And Durazio said, the murderer's identity was a mess. I don't remember offhand who, if anyone, the original killer was supposed to be, but I just remember the resolution from an editorial standpoint being a mess. And again, in this recent tweet, she also said, Rags Morales did absolutely gorgeous work on that book. And it wasn't like Meltzer approached DC out of nowhere with the extreme storyline. The storyline was pretty much given to him. He did the best he could with it. He was hired because he was a comics fan and a best-selling writer. So, two things. Number one, what is your reaction to that?
Oh. I guess we could refer to the fact that Joss Whedon writes the introduction to the trade.
Oh man, that hits you right in the face. I pulled that off the shelf.
And I was like, oh, like I saw that the first name I look at when I pull it off, I was like, oh no.
Introduction by Joss Whedon.
Yeah.
And
when you compare it to Mike Carlin,
yes,
and those allegations too, I went down the rabbit hole and talked and looked at kind of visited Joss Whedon, because there's a lot of characters and actors that I respect that I've worked under and with, and it's hard. Like, it's hard to read some of that stuff.
I don't mean to make light of any of this, but on the Joss Whedon front, at the end of his introduction, it says Joss Whedon is currently preparing to write and direct a Wonder Woman movie for Warner Brothers. Yeah. It's like, well, fascinating to look at that from a 2023 lens. It's like, right. Well, not only did he not make that movie and have all of his issues, but he also left or was dropped from a Batgirl project.
Yes.
That was then later made by other filmmakers that Warner Brothers then threw in the trash cans for a tax credit. So
don't forget he belittled Gal Gadot.
Oh, well, of course.
And said she'd never work again if she didn't watch what she was doing.
Yeah. I think I've just, the Justice League, man, I wasn't even in my head at that moment. I've just blocked it. I've tried to block it. But anyway.
But I mean, it's just, I do like Dan DiDio quite a bit. And I would hope that that's not true. But I know that that's exactly what was being talked about in DC Comics at that time. They were getting destroyed by Marvel, and they were not edgy, and they needed to do stuff like Infinite Crisis, Identity Crisis. They needed to do more authority. They needed to do things that were hard hitting. Oh, I was just kind of thinking about like that meeting, like who was in that room when I said, we need a rape. Like, who says that? Who says that as this is what we need? Nobody needs that. That should have been a different conversation. What are topics that we can cover inside upcoming story arcs? That's the way we approach the conversation.
There's another blog post of hers. She had written about this anonymously at first, but it's very thinly veiled. Yeah. You know what it's about. There was another blog post where she writes about an assistant editor running in after those pages came in. And according to her, literally this other assistant editor or associate editor was saying the rape pages are in.
Oh, gosh.
Now, two things. Number one, I'm just sharing what she has put out there publicly as someone who was the assistant editor and worked on this book. I don't know how accurate or not it is. However, to my knowledge, it doesn't seem like anyone has ever come out to contradict those events. As far as I could find, this is the lawyer, as far as I can find, there wasn't any dispute as to her account of these events. If there was, I didn't come across it. So that's all to say I don't really have a reason to think this is not the case. So based on that, it did color things a little bit for me because, we always talk about the intent behind these things.
Right.
And it's one thing it's one thing for this to kind of come from the top, to come from editorial versus the creator kind of generating it, because I think there is something to be said for that as far as just artistic integrity and where it's coming from and all of that. But it's like, it's one thing for DC to be like, hey, we want to do a murder mystery set in the DC universe. Yeah. It'll sell well, as opposed to exactly like you're saying, we're getting crushed over here. We need to go darker. We need this act of violence specifically, and then we're going to build a story around it.
And it's interesting. The rape, as you're saying, should have been something of a shock, not the center. You look at the name Identity Crisis, it's a double on. It's talking about the identity of a hero, the quote that putting a costume paints a bullseye on your family's chest. It's every hero, whether you're a female hero or a male hero. It's putting yourself out there. There are people that are going to come after your family because of it. As we're sitting here talking, and as we're talking about the planning stages of a concept, it's really easy to sit in a captain's chair and like, well, I would have done this if I was Brad Meltzer. However, I constantly ask myself the question, why would they think it'd be okay to have another woman do what she did to Sue Dibney? Like the spoilers, Jean Loring, like we talked about, Jean has left Ray Palmer. She's upset that Ray has taken their marriage and taken it for granted because he's a hero. She basically wants to bring the heroes' marriages closer together by scaring them, by hurting Sue Dibney, bringing everybody back to their spouse, whether they're estranged, split up, or just need more time together. My question was, why would you have a woman do that to another woman? And secondarily, I think it would have been actually better writing to have Adam Ray Palmer be the one that does it to Sue Dibney. Like he's the one that clearly was feeling the loss of his wife. He missed Jean. Jean left him. Why not have him be the one? But no, they couldn't do that because that would make the males look weak.
You hit the nail on the head, man. Even for all these years, going back to that weekday when I went to alternate realities on my lunch period and I read it in the car, I've never liked it. And even long before I had the understanding of the nuances of the argument that we've just been discussing, even before all of that, it always bugged me that Jean was the one. And yes,
it's weak
in the context of what we're talking about and the fact that it's, again, this woman perpetrating this act against another woman, that's its own thing. But even just as far as a mystery goes, in the context of this story, it always bugged me because, to your point, and you are 1,000% right. And as I was rereading it, I was really zeroing in on this. I understand not wanting to overplay your hand, right? If she had come across as too desperate or too clingy or too wanting, too interested in getting back together, okay, that might let the reader in on what's going on.
Yeah.
But you read it, and there is nothing to indicate that Ray would not be interested in rekindling things. Right. Again, as these scenes play out, they're initially meeting. She's signing over the patents that she had been awarded in their divorce. Like she's signing them back over to him.
Ray's the one that's hurt by all this.
Yeah.
Jean's fine. That's the thing that threw me off.
That has bothered me from day one. It still bothers me to now. I think that is a genuine shortcoming of this story. It does not track. Right. And it would have been a far better twist. When you get to the end of issue 6, right? And we've had this question that Batman posed, right? Yeah. Who benefits? Right. Who benefits when the wife of a superhero is murdered? It's the families, the loved ones of the other heroes.
Correct.
Because all the other heroes will pull them in close. And hand in hand with this, you have Dr. Midnight. I loved all the Dr. Midnight autopsy stuff.
Best.
That was great. And there's that issue of JSA by Geoff Johns and Dave Gibbons where it's all about that autopsy and back and forth with Dr. Midnight and Mr.
I've always
Terrific.
loved Dr. Midnight as a character in general. So
it's so good. But when he finds those tiny footprints on Sue's brain, and you see Ray with the creepy look in his eyes as he and Sue are preparing to get intimate there, it's like, oh my God, like, and that tracked because as we're saying, he's the one in their earlier interactions. He's the one who seems hurt and would
just
be open to this.
That would all they would have had to do was take out Sue faking her own suicide. I mean, Jean faking her own suicide. Just take that bit out, insert something else, and it would attract having Jean looking at Ray like Ray is looking at Jean. It's like, you're a hero. How could you do this to your friend? Well, I wanted you back. And I was broken by you. Like, but that again would, like, if you look at how the editorial staff is talking and how they're so nonchalant about the trope, they would never in 100 million years make one of their male heroes look that weak. And it's infuriating. It's bad writing. It's like weak writing to me.
It is, because the upshot of all of this, I feel like
it's not a risk.
And I feel like the only rational takeaway you can have from Jean in this story, from what's presented, is she crazy.
Yeah.
That's it. because of what we've seen, right? There's no rational basis for why she would take these steps based on what we've seen in her interactions with Ray. And even as she's admitting to this, it's like there's just, she clearly, in terms of what she's saying and how she's depicted, clearly unhinged.
What the problem is, that's the only time in the book she seems unhinged. Like every time else, she is the calm, collected one. She is, listen, I'm not okay with this. I'm done. And rightfully so. Like we've seen Dinah walk away from Ollie. We've seen other people walk away. We've seen Lois get pretty pissed at Clark. And this is the thing. It's weak writing because he should be the one that realizes he's taking her for granted. But she's a strong, independent woman and went, no, I'm done. I don't need you. Go be a scientist hero. We're good. And see, like, he should have the crazy eyes. But then you go ahead and make her the crazy woman who wants her man back. And that, oh my gosh, like, as a father of daughters and married to a strong woman, no, it doesn't track.
Yeah, again, and also just in terms of everything else that's been done to Sue in this story, it's so egregious. You would think, like, that's the thing. I think there are ways to have sort of mitigated what went on earlier in the story had more been explored from Sue's perspective, or at least at a minimum, if we had had a better resolution. And I do truly think that Ray would have been, and again, to be clear to anyone who's like, oh, this is about women in refrigerators. No. I'm even putting that aside for a minute. I think just in the context of this story, I don't think Jean is the appropriate culprit here. Also, too, I mean, I agree with you. They wouldn't want to sully Ray Palmer, but it's like they throw Ray Palmer away after this story. Like,
literally disappears. Yeah.
So again, I don't want to belabor any points, but these aren't separate pieces to this. Yeah. And the last thing I want to say, I referred to this earlier, but the CBR interview that Brad Meltzer did on the 15th anniversary, so in 2019, he gave this interview. And CBR asked this question. I might have worded it a little bit differently, but at least they broached the subject.
Oh, no.
At least, no, they broached the subject. I think they could have narrowed it, but it's fine. CBR asks, the biggest part of the response to Identity Crisis revolved around the female characters in the book. It was bookended by tragic events for Sue Dibney and Jean Loring, and that aspect of the series got a very polarizing response even back then. Now we're in a different place in society in terms of how we talk about issues like domestic abuse and so much of what informed your series. Would you write it differently today if you had the chance to do it again, or do you not play those mental exercises?
Are we differently informed? Like that's what bothers me. That's just one little phrase too. We're more well informed, are we? Like,
yeah. So I didn't know how he would respond to this. And to be clear, I do want to make this point. I'm not looking for him to apologize for his work, right? It was what it was. But at the same time, I guess I was expecting something along the lines of, hey, that was at that point, 15 years, a decade and a half ago. I might approach the material differently. Like something along those lines. Not like, I would toss the whole thing out, but like something to that effect, maybe.
I'm not like upset with Brad Meltzer from how he used the trope or how he approached it or how he was told. I think it's just weird to me that it's sloppy. Like we've all seen good murder mysteries. And when there's like, oh my gosh, I didn't see that coming, you go backwards and you go, oh, I should have seen that coming. When you go backwards from Identity Crisis, it doesn't make sense.
It's the same problem and I've talked about this on other podcasts before, it's the same problem I always had with Hush.
Yes.
Hush remains this great book that you can give to someone who's not really familiar with Batman.
But Tommy doesn't track.
Yeah. Well, no, Tommy I'm okay with. It's the Riddler piece that I'm just like, and you go back and you read it and Riddler pops up once and it's like there's nothing really that tips you off. I mean, and again, not tip you off is not even the right term because like we're saying, it should be something, I feel like the best mysteries.
Yeah.
You read it the first time and you don't know.
You missed it.
And then once you have that information, you go back and it all becomes clear. And I feel like in both the case of Hush, with the Riddler reveal in particular, like the thing with Tommy Elliott, you introduce a new character who's the surgeon and this long lost friend we've never seen before. And then all of a sudden we have a new villain in surgical bandages. It's like, it's obvious, but it's like, okay, it's not like it doesn't make sense.
And whether you love this movie or not, that's your own opinion. But the reason I love Knives Out is when I first saw that movie, when you go back then, you go, oh my gosh, how did we miss that? And it's good writing. So I'm not mad at Brad. I'm just kind of like, dude, like I feel like he missed something. I feel like we missed the boat on that.
And I
But there's also we're going to get to, like, honestly, folks, we're going to get to some really great things to talk about.
Yeah, look, I hope, I trust the audience, and I hope that you guys are with us and you understand where we're coming from. And I feel like these things need to be addressed. It's like, to jump in here and be like, that Deathstroke fight was so awesome. And I feel like it needs to be discussed.
Not honor it correctly.
Yeah. So, anyway, that's why we've kind of taken the road we have. But anyway, this is what Meltzer said. He goes, I think it's dangerous to take old work and try to rewrite it for whatever today's standards are supposed to be for a particular moment. If you do that, you're starting to write by focus group and by groupthink. No great story will ever come from that. I think that anyone who read this book knows there are really hard issues in the book. There are moments about people and about us, about rape and about violence. Even when I look back on it, it's a hard moment to read. It's designed to be. A little bit more. I'll go through it quickly. I remember at the time people were writing, rape has no place in a comic. To me, if you say in any medium that subjects are off limits, well, I'll say it this way. I wish there was no rape in the universe. I wish that awful event never took place. But if we say that we can't discuss this as a culture, we're in an even worse place than just having it exist. It will always be uncomfortable. That's what art always has to do. Our medium has to deal with those issues, and that's what it's always done. It may not please everyone, but art is not always meant to please you. It's at its best meant to challenge you. This is where he lost me a bit because I think
there's valid points in that statement.
Sure. Yeah. Again, but I don't think, I'm sure there are categories of fans who just don't think that topic has any place in comics generally. And perhaps his comment addresses that piece of it, but I don't think it addresses the more specific point here about how it was used.
Yeah.
I think that's the problem. It's not so much, again, I'm sure there are people like it shouldn't have been in there at all, but I think this kind of misses the point of, well, if you are going to do it, don't use it as a plot device.
Yeah.
And that's what's missing here in his response. I was disappointed by that. I'm not gonna lie. Mm-hmm. But anyway, it was interesting to kind of see, because I was curious. That was the big thing. I was curious in all these years with all the articles, and I was like, has he addressed this? Right. What is his position on it now? So there you go. As of the 15th anniversary, we'll see any 20-year anniversary interviews that come up if anything's changed.
I'd be curious if they even address it again. I don't know. I wonder, based on how we're reading about things, whether they'll be like, hey, 30th anniversary. Like, they're not going to touch it again.
Yeah, we will see. But look, this is such, when you talk about the crisis events and you talk about DC publishing history, this is it's a big book, and it definitely paved the way for what led to Infinite Crisis.
Right.
It really set the tone for a few years at the publisher.
And I don't think you can read Identity Crisis without reading the JLA Crisis of Conscience from the JLA run that Geoff Johns wrote there. Like, they really do pair well. I think you would be doing it an injustice by stopping at the end of Identity Crisis and not reading that trade, because it does bring a lot of interesting things to light. It does have Batman finally get to talk and defend himself a little bit about the 10 minutes, about the friendship versus the 10 minutes. Like, friends wouldn't have to take away 10 minutes from me. Friends would talk to me in the first place. And there's that too. It's even if you talk to Batman, maybe you didn't like his choice, but maybe it's the right choice. But yeah, where do you want to start? Like, where do you want to go next?
What I want to ask you is, I do still want to get to this larger question about how Identity Crisis fits into this Red Skies event that we're doing, because it's not a quote unquote crisis level event in the way that Crisis on Infinite Earths is, or Infinite Crisis. It's interesting though. It is and it isn't, because we are dealing with, it is a story that touches the whole of the DC universe, not in a intergalactic component, but certainly Earthbound, right? So it does touch on kind of a wide scope within the DC universe, and it does rewrite continuity in a sense, because it takes these older stories and shows you what was going on between the panels there.
Yes. And it's a crisis. I said it's not world shattering, but then I'm thinking about even that phrase, like, actually it is kind of world shattering. It's shattering for the world of the hero and what they deal with and what we don't see behind the scenes. So how, like, and even if, as I said in the Crisis of Conscience, you get to see Supergirl go to Themyscira and talk to Wonder Woman. And this is right out of her killing Maxwell Lord. And her saying, if you talk to Superman and Batman, they don't agree with what I did. Here's why I did this. And having the discussion and talking through that. There are a lot of hard topics and crises happening that Identity Crisis touched on.
Yeah. The reason why I chose when we talk about this Red Skies run of episodes that we're doing, not every story we're discussing has crisis in the title. For example, right? We're going to hit Flashpoint, we're going to hit the Metal Wars, Doomsday Clock, but they're still part of this conversation that we're having. Not every single story that has crisis in its title earns an episode.
Right.
Sorry, Heroes in Crisis. I'm just not touching that one.
Nope,
I'm not touching that one.
We'll talk about it.
Sorry. But this one always felt like a no-brainer because initially I was looking at it more from the perspective of, well, it sets the stage for Infinite Crisis. But, love it or hate it, it really paves the way for that. And then, I think it ties in, again, I don't know exactly how everything unfolded at DC behind the scenes. I think it tied in with kind of what they wanted to do with this larger event and looking at all the corners of the DCU and the distrust. Right?
It's not a multiverse crisis.
No.
It's a philosophical crisis.
Yeah, and an emotional one.
Yeah.
But again, as we're talking about it in terms of how it, quote unquote, rewrites continuity by shedding a new light on stories that we had experienced before. And yeah, in terms of I don't know, kind of how it upheaves everything within the DC universe, but from an emotional standpoint, less so than, like you said, it's world shattering from an emotional standpoint, not in terms of the physical,
world, not the
literal world.
Yeah.
So I do genuinely think it earns the title. The covers, I do just want to shout out for a second by the late, great Michael Turner. Amazing covers that really tell their own story as you're making your way through this. Probably my favorite is the cover to issue 2, where you see that subset of Satellite era Justice League characters as they're looking at the audience, and Barry Allen's got his eyes closed, his head, hung low in shame for being the deciding vote to lobotomize Dr. Light. But the covers are gorgeous. The cover to issue number 1 has Superman in the center crying.
Which is so interesting.
Well, it's not a crisis if Superman's not weeping. Of course,
he's really not involved.
He's not. Well, that's the thing. The other thing too, as for this podcast generally, right? It's always about Superman, and even this event, we look at how it affects the DC universe, each of these stories, but also the Superman of it all. And there is some Superman to be had and talked about here. But yeah, this is not a story where he's front and center. He is on that first cover. I give them credit though, because I do remember when this was coming out, we didn't know what the hell this story was about.
No. And there's a coffin in the middle of issue 1.
Yeah.
So we're like, who just went down?
I know. Like, is it Lois? Like, I remember, like, we were all like, what is going on here? So
I think I forget how they marketed it, but you knew that it was not a hero. It was somebody connected to them emotionally or family that dies. And you're like, what did they do? My brain went to Lois when I first saw that.
Yeah.
Because you see Superman crying in the middle. So
yeah, I mean, it certainly leads you down one page. Even the hardcover, he's still most prominent here in the center here. I know we got to sell some books here, but that is a bit misleading. But I liked how they hid the ball in the marketing, because so often they give everything away. So this was a really cool instance where you didn't know, and it really kept you on the edge of your seat as you were reading. I mean, again, people experience this in different ways. I would imagine the majority of people at this point now, almost 20 years later, who have read it in a collected edition in one sitting. But people who read it monthly as it was coming out.
It's messed up.
I remember, do you remember the theories? Not so much about the victim, but who the ultimate killer was?
No.
So I feel like I came across this on some message board, and then I didn't pass it off as my own, but I definitely popularized it at the shop. I remember, because we get this business about when the secret society of supervillains switch bodies with the Justice League, and then they switch back.
Oh, sure.
And I remember there was a theory that what if one of them didn't switch back or something like that? How that would have actually played out logistically. But yeah, that's the idea. Like, someone didn't switch back, and I remember, we were talking about that at the store and everyone was excited. And then obviously that ended up not being the case. But yeah, it was very exciting and very intriguing as far as how this was all going to play out. Again, as we talked about, the ultimate payoff, a bit underwhelming, but it was definitely fun to be guessing as we go on. But this is what I wanted to ask you, especially when we talk about rewriting continuity. Because look, we've talked about the Bronze Age a bunch of times, and that's the the era that Meltzer is playing with here, right? As we're looking back and we're showing this was the darkness that was kind of beneath the surface. You read all these quote unquote, simpler, more innocent stories. And in between the panels here, we have this violence, we have this mind wiping of the villains. It's like, why do you think these villains were always so silly and ineffectual over all these years? Well, because we were tampering with their minds. I guess and I know this is really the heart of this ethical question at the center of this book here, but yeah, I mean, how do you feel, not so much about what the heroes do, but about the book itself kind of casting that new light on these stories that people grew up with?
I guess the question I had when you're finding out Zatanna's messing with everybody, and she's I guess lobotomized was an interesting word, first of all, too, because they're still functional.
Yeah.
They're a different person. They're literally a different personality. My question was, why didn't you go into Arkham? Like if we were doing this.
Oh, like to be more proactive?
Yeah. Like why didn't we go in, like we just kept letting Joker kill people? Like if you were going to do this and do it behind Batman's back, clearly, why didn't you do it to Joker? Why didn't we do it more? And I think that was the thing we were finding out. Like, well, who didn't she do it to? Who did they erase? I go back and forth ethically. I guess I don't know how I feel about it. Does that make sense? Like that's kind of interesting. It's like, well, we need to make sure he doesn't do it, because that was the defense, right? It was Dr. Light. He said, I'm just going to find her again. I'm going to do it again. You can't stop me. And then they're all broken. They're like, we can't let this happen to her again. And we're going to erase him, but not just erase him, erase his urge to do that, which was interesting.
No, for
It's
sure.
like Clockwork Orange.
Yeah. So it's funny as we're unpacking this aspect of it, not to drudge up, older controversy now, but not older than this story.
Yeah, sure.
Man of Steel, right? And I'll keep this brief, but I couldn't help but think about this, because I think at this point, when we talk about Clark's killing of Zod in that movie, I think most people recognize that the movie's intention was that he's in a situation where it's either kill Zod or this family's going to be killed. I know there are some out there who will still be like, well, we should have flown him up into the sky. Okay, fine. But I think, again, the movie was trying to say these were his only two options.
And he was told by Zod,
right,
I will kill all of them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think, and again, it's not like I have statistics here that I can really say this with any specificity, but the sense that I get from talking to people and just kind of seeing online, I think a lot of people seem to understand Clark's decision in that moment, but seem to have a bigger problem with the movie putting him in that position in the first place. And I'll be honest, for a number of years, that was the argument I made. For years, I was always like, well, I get why he did it, but I wish that the movie didn't do that, didn't cast him in that light.
Right.
As I've talked about on the show, it's been a journey, it's been a process. I've shifted my perspective on that. I get what the movie was doing, and I'm okay with it. But I can't help but think about it in the context of this story of Identity Crisis, because again, I feel like if you poll 1,000 comics fans, the notion of certainly erasing memories, I feel like people probably wouldn't have too much memories of villains in particular. Batman's a separate conversation, but erasing memories, I don't know that's when we're talking about preserving secret identities. I think people are probably okay with that. The altering of personalities, it gets a little dicier, but again, I feel like most people probably would ultimately be okay with that. But I think there might be this larger feeling of, but why even broach this subject? Why even take these stories? And the reason why I ask, and I ask you, and I know your love of the Bronze Age, is like, don't
forget the old stories. Like, that's the thing. They already set the tone, because there were the stories where they all learned their identities. They all learned the superheroes' identities, not their family members. They learned who they are. And that's the answer. We have to erase these names from their memories. Right. So it starts there. Like,
no, but I guess just kind of in a broader sense, like I don't want to say I don't have a horse in this race, but I didn't grow up reading those Bronze Age stories. Right. I don't have any attachment to them. But I think about how I might feel if some writer came along and was like, hey, all those Superman Triangle era stories you read? This is what was going on between the panels. And I might feel a certain way about that. Yeah. So I'm kind of asking more in that context. Like, as far as casting those old stories in this new light, and look, we can talk about headcanon, and you can go back and look at those old stories and not think about it, but I guess that's kind of what I'm curious about, how you feel about that.
I guess I feel that it was an interesting, what I like about Identity Crisis was it was an angle we've never taken before. Because the Bronze Age, first of all, let's all be clear, I was not reading comics in the Bronze Age. As nice as Anthony is to me, telling me how, I wasn't reading them when they were coming out. Neither was I, everybody, just so we're clear. I just love it, the era.
I'm not trying to add like 2 decades to your age.
So Bernie was born in 57. But we've set the tone about the heroes' identities and those being mind wiped. Forever, we all would read stories and realize that it just kind of seemed like everybody in the heroes' lives were off limits. There were never real stakes. Now, like Iris West, or like people have died, but it wasn't. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't remember brutal deaths of non-heroes. Like nobody killed Jimmy Olsen. Nobody's killed. All like a sidekick in that way. Don't forget, we're not going to call Jason Todd. He's a hero. So, but do you know what I'm getting at? Like that was kind of off limits, and to now take the angle of okay, the wives, the spouses, they're on the table now. That to me is like, oh, okay, if they're on the table now, maybe we need to readdress the mind wipe concept, and so I don't have like, how would we feel?
Yeah.
Of our own spouses. Like, whoa, that's like, forget the rape trope. Let's talk about just they're not going to stop coming after my wife because they know who I am or who she is.
Right. Yeah. I want to talk about like the ethics within the context of the story. The last thing I'll say sort of in this meta textual sense is the closest experience I think I have with this, again, another Marvel reference here, but it's funny because it's been so many years now since I read Spider-Man regularly, but he's my favorite Marvel character. And I would say from the mid 90s through the mid aughts, I was all in on Spider-Man. I read all the books. I followed everything. And the Sins Past storyline by Straczynski in Amazing Spider-Man stopped me dead in my tracks. The revelation that Gwen Stacy had this affair with Norman Osborn that resulted in these kids. My understanding, again, I really haven't read in years. I think this has since been retconned. Previously, it was just kind of ignored by subsequent writers. And then I think it's actually been properly retconned at this point. But I remember, not to be hyperbolic, but like I remember feeling sick, like reading that issue, that flashback issue.
Like that's messed up.
It was so messed up. And it's like, you can't help but kind of color then how you look back at those other stories. So again, I say all of this for anyone, especially older fans who did grow up reading these stories.
Right.
If you feel some sort of way about that aspect of it, I do understand. Now, as far as the morality of it within the context of this story, so just like with Man of Steel, I think it's a worthwhile topic to explore and a question to pose. And so that's why that this aspect of the story, how we deal with these villains and even with each other when it comes to Batman, I think that piece of it is where this book is strongest.
Well, yeah, and we could say of so many stories like, well, maybe just don't go down that road to begin with. But what if we did go down that road? Like, what would it look like? What are the consequences? It's ultimately a what if story. We could just treat Identity Crisis because of all the New 52, Rebirth, all that kind of stuff. We're ultimately treating this like a what if. What if the spouses were under fire? How would they deal with it? And I think it's a road worth talking about. It's not a road we want to live on. It's not a road we want to travel on, but it's a road that, what if we went down it?
No, absolutely. And that 3-part Bronze Age story, it was fine. Yeah. It was fine. Didn't light my world on fire, but it was fine. But what was fascinating about it, and this is why this is one of the things I do appreciate about Identity Crisis. There are things I liked. I know you spent a lot of time setting the table here, but it was important that we did. So in that 3-part story, there's no point in that story where the villains who have switched bodies with the Justice League members remove the masks.
Correct.
And in particular, they've switched bodies with, it's five members in question.
Yes.
But 2 of them, Batman and Green Lantern, have masks that could be removed. And what's funny is that in Identity Crisis, you see what happened between the panels, where they did, in fact, take off those masks and discover Bruce Wayne as Batman, Hal Jordan as Green Lantern. Now, would they have known who the hell Hal Jordan was? No, probably not. But Bruce Wayne, they would have. But what's so funny is that my memory of Identity Crisis and its depiction of those events was so strong that it took me a minute after I finished reading that 3-part Bronze Age story to be like, oh, wait a minute. They never actually did that whole taking the mask off bit. But it's one of those things where I would imagine it's actually kind of shocking to me that the story didn't even touch on that because it seems like such a no-brainer. And I would imagine kids or adults reading those stories in the 70s, 60s, 70s?
70s. Yeah.
Might have had that question like, hey, when so-and-so was in Batman's body, wouldn't he take off the cowl? Like, it's such a natural question.
I feel like there's a Justice League Unlimited episode.
Yeah, the Great Brain Robbery,
yes,
where Lex and Flash switch. And it's this great bit where Lex takes off Flash's helmet or mask and he's like, who the hell is this guy?
Who's this guy? Yeah, it wasn't anybody famous. Yeah. That's by the way, that's Belle's favorite episode ever.
It's such a great one. But I guess my point is like that's such a natural course of events and such a natural thing to imagine those villains doing. And so that's where I look at what Meltzer did in this story where it's like, yeah, of course they would do that. Like we didn't see it in that story for whatever reason. They didn't broach that subject, but it's like, well, of course that would happen.
Yeah.
So how does the Justice League deal with that? And again, I think that's a valid question to ask. And I mean, my personal ethics here, I really don't have any qualms about erasing the names or anything to that effect.
Yeah.
Now, yes, it gets dicier when we talk about altering personalities here. So,
but does it?
Well, that's the question, I guess.
Because that's the thing. So we send people to Arkham. We even in our current like non-superhero lives in the real world, we send people to rehabilitation to try to not be the way they are. So Zatanna's going, okay, let's just get rid of all this. Let's get rid of the year of rehab programs. Boop, and just change them.
Well, see now, I don't mean to
go
back
ahead.
to our topic about the treatment of women in here, but it's like she's not really saying much. It's more, hey, you should do this, and then they vote. So I think,
and then she walks away.
Yeah,
and then ultimately at the end of the JLA run,
JLA
goes,
gave her
I don't
more
care
to do.
how you vote.
Yeah,
I'm out. I'm not doing it.
Yeah, JLA gave her more to do, but she does ultimately clean up. She does ultimately clean up their memories there too. But yeah, I mean, it's this interesting thing, and it was fascinating to see how all this played out. So, Zatanna puts Dr. Light to sleep. Let me also just say, this is a quick side note and I alluded to this before, but with Dr. Light, again, I don't have any attachment to this character, but that was one of the things in the years following the story. It's like sexual predator was his whole thing.
Yeah.
It was just his whole thing. Like they leaned in real hard to that. And I was like, okay, guys, I think we get it. Similarly with the mind wipes, and this is where this ties in. So I read The Secret of Barry Allen.
Oh, okay.
The 4-part.
I didn't get through
that. I didn't ask you to, and I didn't know if I would get to it myself, honestly. But I was like, I caught up in this, and I was like, I want to see more how this was playing out in other books. And it's great because the thing that we find out is that in deciding to alter Light's personality, Barry Allen is the deciding vote. On the one side, for the mind wipe, we have Hawkman, Adam, and Zatanna.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, we have Ollie, Dinah, and Hal. And Barry, the moral vanguard of the DC universe.
Apparently.
The one who everyone else quakes in the lightning of his boots.
Guess so.
Or whatever.
According to the movie.
Yeah. Well, that's... but... he's the one who decides. And as Ollie is relating all of this to Wally, and I love how this played out too, where Wally recognizes that after the funeral, everyone's peeling off and teaming up and looking for suspects. And he notices that this select group, the members I just referenced, stay behind, right? And he's vibrating so quickly that no one sees.
And isn't it Hawkman that's like...
Hawkman catches because he's got the enhanced vision.
It's like, well, you might as well show yourself.
And then I love Ollie being like, all right, come on, Kyle. We know you're there. And he's like, how'd you know? He's like, I didn't.
I bluffed.
And
I do love Ollie through this entire run.
What do I always say when we talk about these events? I like a point of view character.
And there he is.
It's not Ollie, but there's enough.
There's a lot
Ollie,
of it.
and he's more than anyone else.
You see the green boxes a lot through it.
And I think it goes a long way. And I love as he was kind of assessing Wally and Kyle. And it was interesting because he likened Kyle to Barry and Wally to Hal. Yeah. Which I thought was kind of cool. And he noted how, they back each other up in that moment. Yes. And, the stones on these guys, because obviously they've both been around for a while at this point, but still, these are the veterans, the true veterans. Mm-hmm. And they stand their ground and demand answers about this. And that's what brings all of this to light. But in that Secret of Barry Allen 4-part arc by Geoff Johns and Howard Porter, I love Howard Porter's arc. So good. Yeah. That's another run I'll be getting back to at some point as well, because I'm long overdue for a reread of that.
It's incredible.
But Barry, Wally's reeling from this revelation in these issues that Barry was the one who cast the deciding vote to lobotomize Dr. Light. Turns out that's not all Barry did. So he had left Wally a letter via Ollie, who gives him the letter. And what we find out is that Barry enlisted Zatanna's help after all this Dr. Light business, where it seemed like this was, this was going to be it. He enlisted Zatanna's help to alter the mind of the villain, the Top.
Why?
To make him because he had taken over the body of Barry's father. It was a whole thing, but he wanted to go further than they had with Dr. Light. He didn't want to just, again, neuter him, right? Make him silly and ineffectual. Yeah. He wanted to actually fix his mind. And Zatanna does that. And so we see all of this unfolding via flashback as Wally is reading Barry's letter, that the Top became an ally and helped Barry take out other rogues and things like that. But eventually, because his brain was now, quote unquote, fixed, he couldn't deal with the guilt of what he had done. And he started cracking. And ultimately, they had to face off and all that. But the way Barry's letter ends is like, he's still out there. And it's like, I know you're going to have to deal with this at some point. Like, I'm off to the future, Wally, but this is going to be your problem. I'm real sorry. Like, that's kind of the gist of it. But within that flashback piece, the Top tells Barry that, or you know what, I actually might be conflating these a little bit. He might actually tell Wally when Wally confronts him in the present. So at some point, the Top reveals that, I think it is to Wally, that he, the Top, did to other rogues what Zatanna had done to him. He tried to fix them because we had all of these rogues like Trickster and Pied Piper and Heatwave who had gone straight. Yeah. And so now we get this revelation that Top.
He did that. Yeah.
That Top, while, I don't want to say suffering, but while under the effects of what Zatanna had done to him, did the same thing to these other villains. Wow. And then similarly, we had an arc in the Catwoman title by Will Pfeiffer and Pete Woods.
Oh, okay.
Where we find out that Zatanna and the Justice League had, quote unquote, fixed Catwoman.
And that's why she's now an ally.
Which drove me nuts.
Which is garbage.
Is that run, that Ed Brubaker and Darwin Cook run, that era of Catwoman, I love that to death. Mm-hmm. And the whole notion that she's turning over a new leaf, she becomes this kind of anti-hero, this protector
of her character growth.
And so I know that it was kind of a long walk, but the point of it was, just like with Dr. Light and his characterization, just like with the Mind Wipes, I think it was a very interesting idea. I think they just ran with it. It's like, you guys... And I feel like it came at the detriment of characters who had actually grown. Yeah. And now you're undermining that and you're taking it away. So that still doesn't necessarily address.
But you question that as a reader. It was like, okay, what else do we not know? What are they going to reveal to us? That, actually, this person, we changed them too.
Yeah. But with Dr. Light, Hawkman, going back to that night on the satellite, Hawkman's like, what if we clean him up a bit? Yeah. That's the phrase that he uses.
Clean him up a bit.
And then again, the sides form and Barry, and this is Ollie is quick to point out to Wally that this was shortly after Iris had seemingly been killed. Yeah. So you get a sense of where Barry was and the choice that he makes. The saint of the DC universe.
How was she killed?
It was Zoom.
But
she wasn't actually, she was, I haven't actually read.
I don't know the back on that one. Yeah.
Because she ends up alive in the future. So it was, I think she
rewritten.
Yeah, I don't know that it might have been that she didn't actually die. Like she was just transported to the future. It was like something like that. I don't know all the specifics. But at that point in time, Barry thought she was dead.
I don't remember if it was, and you can correct me, if it was Identity Crisis or the Crisis of Conscious JLA. But there is a point that Hawkman says, either we clean him up or I'm going to kill him. Like, which one would you rather have?
I remember in Crisis of Conscience, Hawkman has my two favorite lines in Crisis of Conscience that follow up in JLA. One is when the League and Batman are debating all of this, and Hawkman is like, if I had known this was going to be such a pain, I would have just killed Dr. Light.
Exactly right. Yeah.
On the spot. And also, and again, this all kind of ties together about the morality of what the League is doing here, because there's an issue of Adventures of Superman written by Greg Rucka during the Ruin arc. Yeah. Drawn by Rags Morales. And it is technically a tie-in. It says Identity Compromised, I think, on the cover. But at this point, Superman is contending with Ruin, who knows his secret. And he assembles Batman and Wonder Woman.
Okay.
He's like, guys, like, this guy knows who I am. I don't know what to do. I don't want to have another Dr. Light situation on my hands. This is the moment, and I think this is the first time, audience, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is the first time where Superman explicitly acknowledges that he knows what the League did, and because this comes before Crisis of Conscience.
Well, remember, like, they show Superman here. How did they put it?
He hears what he wants to hear.
What he wants to hear, yeah.
I want to circle back to that in just a second. But in that conversation, so he reveals, like, this is what the League did to Dr. Light. I let them do it. Wonder Woman says, I can't believe you let them do that.
Right.
You should have killed him.
Huh.
Which, again, when we talk about the ethics of this, what is the if those are the two options, if it must be one of the other,
right.
Altering someone's personality or just putting them down.
I don't know.
Taking away who they are, or taking away,
or just
their
taking
life.
them away.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but that's also been the age-old question when we bring the authority, and we're going to see more of those stories, I think, coming to light that people are going to start asking about if we see them in the DC reboot. Like, well, yeah, why don't we have heroes just take them off the board? They're like, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Let's just take him off the board. Why do we keep letting Joker escape? He kills more people, kill more families. So, like, of course, like, we don't want that. It's the whole death penalty argument. But at the same time, what do you do? Like, what would you rather have?
Yeah, and
because Dr. Light cracks.
Yeah,
he sees the scene of them all fighting Deathstroke, and like all of a sudden he remembers everything, and now he's nuts.
That was a great moment.
Oh man, and it's drawn incredibly.
There's, in the back matter of the collected edition, the creative team gives their commentary, and originally Meltzer wanted just 2 pages of white.
Yeah,
and DC talked him down to 1, and then Rags was like, I don't feel right getting paid for a blank
for
page.
2 blank pages. Yeah,
and he was like, he said to Meltzer, like, can I just draw what we end up seeing? So if we don't like it, we won't use it. And obviously they liked it and used it. And it's great. And what's especially cool about this, again, there's a lot that's really, really clever in this, where when Dr. Light remembers, he generates an image of what he's seeing, and Wally clocks it. And that's what prompts that later conversation with Ollie, where he's like, hey, when you told me this story, Batman wasn't there.
Yeah.
But when I saw that image projected by Dr. Light, he has, what happened there? And that's when I get that piece of it. So I thought that was interesting.
And that whole idea too, that Light is sending images and while he's seeing the images, again, guys, like we shouldn't not read this book. We should still read this book. It's still an important, well-written book. But you got to go in knowing, it's kind of like, we were watching a movie the other day, and it was the Mission Impossible Fallout movie because the new one's coming out. And Renee's watching it with us, and she just doesn't do well with when somebody's getting hit really hard. Like Henry Cavill, my man, throwing somebody through a mirror, like through the wall. And she like winces, like, okay, just tell me when he's done beating the crap out of that guy. And then the story continues. It's kind of the same thing. We don't want to talk about or see that rape happening, but it's like, oh gosh, okay, I know what's happening. And even the way it's drawn is done that way, where it stops and then you just like, you know what's going on. Like, we have to take that. We don't like that it's there, but we need to also look at the grand scope of the story and understanding why the rest of the story is important too.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look, I think in terms of the intention at the inception point of this from editorial.
Agreed.
I think there is a definite problem there in terms of where this was coming from. In terms of the execution, yeah, I think there too.
Yeah.
There are ways that this could have been told differently that maybe would have, again, given more due to Sue and given her more agency, given her more voice, give something. There's also, look, again, and I don't want to belabor the point, but as I'm reading it, you can't help but think it's like, had it been more the threat of it as opposed to the actual happening of it? I mean, I feel like again, this begs the question of how necessary was this specifically, right? But in any event, just in terms of, going back to this decision and everything, and the Superman of it all, which we were getting at, where Ollie does have that line, right, about Superman hears what he wants to hear. And then similarly later, we got this revelation that they mind wipe Batman, which again, we'll talk about how we feel about that. But it's Ollie again too, is like Batman knows what he wants to know.
Mm-hmm.
And when he says the line about Superman, we see Superman's ears. He's talking to elongated man. And then later towards the end of the story, there's this moment with Wally and Bruce on the watchtower when you just get this close up on Batman's eyes. And it's like, does he know? Does he not know? Right.
Like, and like Wally even asks like, wait, what?
I have to say, this is one instance where I prefer to just look at Identity Crisis in a vacuum because I like that ambiguity there. Yes. And it's like once you get past this story and then we're in the road to Infinite Crisis and we have all these other stories, we get firm answers on this.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Superman knew and he let it happen.
Yep.
Reading Identity Crisis by itself and just sort of coming to your own conclusion, right? Like either, no, of course he wouldn't know. He wouldn't go along with that. Or no, you know what? I think he would because he would think about Lois and Ma and Pa. It lets you engage with the material in a different way.
But see, that's what it should do.
Yeah.
Like every story we read should make you afterward going, do I like how that turned out? And even how we were talking about Jean Loring. Do I like how they did that to her? Like Sue's the victim, but they also inadvertently made Jean a victim. So like, do we like how that turned out? Like did you read all of the back editorial stuff? So like there's a cool thing that Brad and Rag said, most superhero stories look through telescopes to see giant monsters and worlds, but this uses microscopes to see all the heroes' flaws and imperfections. Like that's why I do think the story is important to read, because if you read it as a road to Infinite Crisis also, you see Superman walking in the line between, like you just said, how do I feel? But I would also feel Batman's just pissed because he doesn't like being not in the know, and now he's been violated. And you also see that Wonder Woman is okay killing. Like she's like, no, that guy's got to die. That was the only way it happened. Because just like Hawkman said, I should have killed him. But it creates more conversation. Like, okay, who do we stand with? These are three members of the hero trinity. Who do we stand with?
Yeah, no, again, I think the philosophical questions it poses there, I think they're valid ones. I that aspect of it, I really did enjoy. And, so I'm on board with that. But no, like what I'm saying is and it's just a function of a shared comic book universe. Of course, we're going to get answers to these questions. I like the brief moment that we lived in where it was up to us as to what the answer would be.
Right.
But of course, later we do get the answers. Again, I believe it's that issue of Adventures of Superman where he expressly articulates that he knows they did it. And he says exactly that. Like, I thought about Lois and Ron. And it's like, and of course, like I don't have any qualms with Superman allowing that for exactly that reason. Batman knowing, and I was digging around here. I don't know at what point I don't know what the first instance is of him saying that he knows. It might be Crisis of Conscience or OMAC Project.
Remember, I think the first moment we learned that Batman knows is when Martian Manhunter says it.
Yes.
It's like, oh, he knows. Like, and you can all see how scared John is. Like, oh no, he knows. And they still can't get to it in time. And just every time Bruce reacts to them.
Oh, that was my other favorite line that also goes to Hawkman from Crisis of Conscience when Batman decks him and Hawkman goes, I hope it was worth it because I'm about to give you 10 minutes you'll never forget.
Yeah, man. That's good.
As far as burns go, man, that one's up there. That was great. It's one of my favorite moments.
I would have loved to watch that too.
Yes. Yeah. No, that was terrific. But again, I like, in the context of this story, I like the ambiguity that it plays with as far as what Superman knows, what Batman knows. You know, that, and I do give the story credit for the layers here because it probably would have been enough that the League had this vote and did what they did to Dr. Light. And again, that he wasn't the only one that they did this to. I mean, I guess on that front, we know now from these subsequent stories, like the Secret of Barry Allen with the top, with the Catwoman story, in the context of Identity Crisis itself, it's clear that they erased memories of other villains.
Yes.
Secret Society of Villains in particular, we see that, and you get the sense there was more. Did you get the sense that they had lobotomized that many more in the context, like from what Identity Crisis gave us?
I didn't feel that. I think it was clear they just erased knowledge.
Yeah.
I never got the let's change the person, especially in Crisis of Conscience when you see those society members come back. They haven't been changed. They just didn't remember things.
Oh, but no, but I think that's the other. I think that's the other angle here, which is, and I feel like this is
Because they
a
were
product.
pissed just that they lost knowledge.
No, but so I think this is a product of Crisis of Conscience or subsequent stories generally, that even when Zatanna only erased memories, inadvertently, it's kind of like messed them up a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
You know, so again, other stories ran with a lot of these ideas. I do think, and now having just reread Identity Crisis, I do think the implication was they had erased memories before numerous times, seen and unseen.
Yeah.
But as far as altering personalities, it really seemed like Dr. Light was that was kind of like the breaking point for them.
Yeah.
But again, now these other stories have kind of
it's
opened up these other avenues of other things they did.
It's a weird violation too. Like think about how certain memories link to other things in your life. Like you can't just erase a person without creating gaps. Like if I was erased from your memory, different conversations or people you knew or talked to about, it'd be odd. And you'd almost have like a blurred vision. Like there'd be like a weird spot. Like you ever get like a floater? There'd be this weird memory floater. Like, but why is there something missing? And I think that's why they're so pissed. It's like, what else am I missing that you took?
Yeah. No, but again, like I like this position it puts them in, because it really does beg the question. I think it is a fascinating thought exercise from our perspective as fans thinking about these characters, because if you're in a situation where a villain has discovered your identity or perpetrated an even worse violation like Dr. Light does and is threatening to do it again, it's like, what are your choices, right? Because you can't just lock them up. The secret will be out.
No.
Right? You could, again, kill them, but then that's, again, what's worse as far as altering minds versus taking the life. Phantom Zone, I mean, that's no picnic. So, and
they cover all of that. They talk about it. Like, what do we do?
Yeah. So I think what they ultimately, and I think that's the thing, and it's in one of these stories, I feel like it might be Crisis of Conscience, where Zatanna says, if push comes to shove, I think I would do the same thing again.
Yeah. And that's why she walks away. She's worried about that. She goes, I can't promise that I won't do it again.
Yeah.
So she kind of pulls an Adam and just boop, like, I'm out. I'll take care of these things, but then I gotta.
It's funny because you almost want, like, I don't want to say it's, I guess my perspective of it is, it's like, well, of course, what else are you going to do? Because in Crisis of Conscience, when they've apprehended the secret society and then they call another vote, right?
Yeah.
And does Superman outright say no?
Well, he I think starts to, and that's when Zatanna jumps in. She goes, listen, I don't care, because he was about to say his vote. And she goes, it doesn't matter who or what you decide, I'm not going to do it. And she just dips.
Yeah. Which, again, and this is another instance, and I recognize that I do this, where I transpose my morality onto Clark.
Yeah.
Because I'm reading this, and it's like, they know who your wife is. Of course you have to erase their memory. How is this even a question?
Yeah. Like, stop. Like, make it go away.
Yeah. I mean, it can't, but I guess that's these paragons of virtue. It's like this idea of, well, I don't know, we've chosen this, and this is a consequence. We have to live with it.
So let's go back just a little bit, because this is the curiosity that I wanted to ask you. We're talking about how do we fix, like, ultimately we're talking about how do we fix a story? How do we make this work? All right. So if we don't have Dr. Light rape Sue, what do they, like, what is the thing that happens that creates the mind wipe?
I get what you're saying, because there's,
like, is it a death? Do they just outright, see what I'm saying? Like, is it a miscarriage? Or is it something? Who knows? Because it's not a good plot device. It's just how it's the focus.
Well, that's the thing, right? Because there's this, in learning about what's gone on behind the scenes for all those years, there's this escalation, right? And so a villain learning the hero's secret identity has been enough to warrant a mind wipe, right? In the context of this story, it's like, well, something more has to happen for us to go beyond merely erasing a few minutes or erasing a name. Like, we're now going to, quote unquote, clean him up, change his personality. So what would justify that beyond just he found out their identity?
Well, and I wonder too, I cannot, Brad Meltzer, like you're listening, like he's not worried about my opinion, but I wonder if they revealed that too soon. Like, because that they reveal it in issue 2.
I know.
So I wonder if it was like if maybe it happened a second time. So the first time was he gets on there and he like grabs her and they stop him, but then he promises, I'm gonna find her again, and then he does find her again, and we learn about that in issue 5.
Yeah,
because then it's going whoa because I think we learned A, too soon, B, too big, C, like mind wipe, like it needed to have some depth to it, because I think that's the issue I have where we used it
for shock value.
It's shock value, and it's shock value quickly at the beginning, and it makes it feel like that's what the story is about, instead of, no, this is a history of madness and really sexual violence, and like you could insert anything like that.
And if you had, I think if it quote unquote has to be there, but it's done more in that way, and you can actually explore Sue's reaction to like any of this.
Yes.
Yeah, I think
because then
it's like
you're seeing flashbacks to that a little bit more. And again, I just think it could have been done in a way where it wasn't such a focused plot device, but it was along the path that led to the mind wipe. The mind wipe and the identity knowledge is the issue. It's the identity crisis. That's the issue, not the why do they have to do it.
Right. It's fascinating too. So you were on not too long ago. We did our Mark Waid double feature. You and I talked about World's Finest, but then the second half of that, we talked about Waid's JLA run.
Yeah.
And I brought up something there that I want to circle back to now, which was in Waid's run, there's a whole plot point about how the League, another point of distrust among them because of Batman's Tower of Babel plans, right?
Yeah.
But the way they come back together is they reveal their secret identities to each other. It's a huge deal.
It's great.
It's a huge deal.
Yeah.
I always bumped up against this in Identity Crisis. I think it has to be this way for the story to work and for Meltzer to create this community that I do respond to in the story. But the continuity nerd in me is like, wait a minute. Not all that long ago, it was such a huge deal for the Big Seven and Plastic Man to reveal their identities to each other. And now everyone and their wife knows everyone's secret identity in the DC universe.
Yeah.
So again, I don't think that lines up, but it's fine. It works for the context of the story.
Understand, like, there's the understanding that you tell everything to your wife. That's the philosophy.
Yeah.
That you don't keep secrets from each other for each other's safety, for the idea of trust. To truly have a good connection and partnership, you trust each other. You tell her that Bruce Wayne is Batman.
Yeah.
But that's putting that knowledge is heavy. Because God forbid she gets we can go down a lot of storylines with that knowledge.
What's the other thing that's fascinating about this story is that, again, identity crisis and sort of, I think it definitely highlights the importance of the secret identity. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad we've talked about this here and there about how we've seen this trend in recent years. The Marvel movies are a major example of this. The Bendis era of Superman, where Clark reveals his identity. I'm glad, thankfully, that's
retconned.
That's been put back in the bottle there. But I think, there's a lot to be said for why a superhero would need that. Yeah. And I think this story definitely showcases that. So I like that aspect. But what's funny is that it ends up being someone from within, right? So it's
not a villain.
Again, and it's like this community that they fostered where, at the end of the story, and it is a very beautiful scene where Ralph is talking to Sue, even though she's not there. But there's this whole thing about how like Lois is a bad cook. And just this idea that like in the DC universe, right, they socialize, they have these dinners, and it's like it's known that like Lois can't cook, but they won't say anything because it's Superman. But it's like that camaraderie, that sense of community, that letting their guard down just within their quote unquote walls. Yeah. That proves to be their undoing. Because it's not one of these villains that had mind wiped. It was Jean Loring.
Well, and what an interesting plot line it could have been is one of their own is selling the information to the calculator.
Yeah.
Or Sue is the ultimate tipping point before is she's kidnapped by Dr. Light and other villains. Like, tell us what you know. We know who you're with. Tell us who you are. Like, tell us who Superman is and that kind of stuff. But it just, again, I think there's a lot of quality scenes. Do you want to talk about the Deathstroke fight?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Do we have to take a break, or are we okay?
No, we're good. I just want to say that when you just mentioned the calculator, that's, again, when we talk about this feeling like a very lived in world, the idea that it's not just the heroes, right? The villains get together, the villains fraternize, the villains share information. There's the villain equivalent of Oracle, i.e. the calculator. And when we get the backstory here, it's this notion that, Black Canary was in the middle of a fight and they overheard her talking to someone in Oracle and realized, oh, there's this information broker.
Yes, they know things.
And we can do the same thing too. Again, it's such a great touch. And again, just feels like
the lounge they hang out in together, like where you see them.
This is what would happen.
Yeah.
This is what would happen.
Yeah.
So I like that a lot. And even things like, again, Captain Boomerang, he's a joke, even within the ranks of the villain community. It's like, oh, that guy.
Well, and what did we don't really learn what he did. That, because remember there's the like, nobody's hiring you anymore, or like we never find out why he's shunned. We also never find out who Owen's mom is.
It's Melanie Thawne. So this comes up in Geoff Johns' final Flash storyline.
Oh,
with
so then
Wally.
I wouldn't have known that if I read this.
No, so like he's bounced through time and he ends up in the future and he encounters a Thawne, and that's kind of the I don't know all of the specifics, but I know at least that much. But yeah, as far as because you're right, Calculator does have that bit where he says to Captain Boomerang, like, after what you did.
Exactly. We never learned that.
And when Jean Loring is recounting, or when the heroes are talking about what she said happened to her when she was allegedly, and when we, the audience, see the quote unquote memory of the person behind the door waiting for it, clearly could be him. So some good misdirect there, where it seems, and you get the story does lull you into that. I mean, some issues left. It's not going to be the end of it. But it does lull you into that false sense of security, where it's like, okay, like it seems like Captain Boomerang was the one, and now he and Drake have killed each other. But of course, Jean was the one who had set that up and everything. But yeah, the Deathstroke fight. Go for it.
Oh, okay. So I just love, where is it? Man. So first of all, let's go to the end of it with how Ollie. First of all, Ollie describes hero by hero how Deathstroke has already figured out how to stop all of them, and how ultimately he saves Kyle for last, because he has to figure out, he tests, what if I break your fingers and I try to ultimately fool the ring into thinking that my hand is your hand. And it's hard. It's out of control. How he takes down every one of them so quick, and he somehow can see Wally coming at him too. Were you just losing? I'm reading it I was like, oh my God, it's amazing. I wanted to see it in live action.
Yeah, it was cool. Yeah, the way that he had these contingencies for all of them, I thought was great. I mean, beginning with Wally, the notion that he has these bombs planted and he knows that will divert him to a certain point, and that's
right
how he gets him. Yeah. No, that was cool. Not to nitpick. It's a very cool. It's a very cool scene, but it's just like, guys don't have to wait. I know he's fast.
Go all five. You go.
Yeah, go all at once. Why is this one at a time? It's the same. But drives me nuts all the time too with Superman and especially not just Superman, but a lot of these superheroes in live action shows in particular. Like on the Flash show, drove me nuts for years.
Super speed, go.
Super speed. Why do you run up to the scene and stop and wait to get hit or
to see what's happening? You can see it in super speed. Get him, nail him now.
I know that always drove me nuts, but it's fine. I know it can go on.
It adds drama, Anthony.
I know that's my only, and that's fine. That doesn't take me out of it. It's a very cool scene, and it definitely shows how formidable he is.
And the arrow in the eye socket. That's the thing. Yeah. At least Ollie was cool and didn't do it in his good eye.
Yeah.
He just right in his dead eye socket, and the way Rags draws just the freaking anger on Slade's face. It's just out of control.
Look, the art generally, he captured the humanity of all the proceedings, and it's I don't have much to say that hasn't already been said, but the scene of Ralph literally incapable of holding his form together.
He's falling apart into his hands. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
And then contrast that with the rage that Ralph shows when he's like, "Find me Dr. Light."
Yeah.
No, I mean the art was gorgeous here. Really, again, I think just that the humanity that it was able to depict on the page, it really helped sell this kind of story where you are being asked to buy into these characters as people and not just as these larger than life archetypes, but as actual people who live and interact in this DC universe world. So yeah, I've always enjoyed his work, but yeah, he really knocked it out of the park on this.
Yeah. Trying to think if there's anything else that like stood out.
I mean, as far as the Batman mind wipe of it all,
Yeah.
again, we find out late in the story that Batman had interrupted them as they were altering Dr. Light's mind. And again, as Ollie says, this time it was unanimous. They all vote for Zatanna to remove those 10 minutes from his memory. And again, to my knowledge, in subsequent stories, I don't know that we ever... I'm going to be rereading OMAC Project for our next episode, so
cool.
I'll know then. But I don't know that we're ever shown a moment where he explains how or when or why he remembered this.
Learns,
but it's like, it's Batman, so I think we can very easily fill in the gaps. Like if that guy were missing 10 minutes, he would probably recognize it.
Right. Because again, there's going to be a dead spot.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, just I guess from the... it's one thing to talk about how we should treat how the hero should treat these villains. Mm-hmm. But in the context of Batman, I guess, how do you feel about what the League decided in that moment?
I don't fault them because you also know how he dealt with Tower of Babel.
True.
Like, he's not exactly the pinnacle of trust when it comes to them. He held all that information. Like, just if. Like, that's not okay. Like, yeah, everybody understands the rationale, but they had a good reason to not trust Batman. So for him to kind of cry, like, how dare you? They're like, dude, you just did this to all of us. So I don't know. I don't know if he's warranted in the way he reacts, but maybe he's pissed because he sees the hypocrisy.
Well, okay, but here's how I think maybe we can tie all of this together and reconcile it. This all happened in the past, right? Tower of Babel is far more recent. So
I guess I'm not looking at that correctly.
So I think, in terms of when we're learning the information.
We're learning it, yeah.
We're learning it after
For
Tower
him,
of Babel.
He's now seen, you did this to me in the past. This is why I did this to you in the future, maybe?
I think that might be... It's funny because, again, we'll be revisiting OMAC Project next week in our Countdown to Infinite Crisis episode. And I have not reread it as of this recording, but... we do find he created this OMAC project to spy on everyone out of this paranoia.
Right.
And so...
When did he find out? Maybe that helps us.
Yeah.
When did he find out? And maybe did that help? Did that push him into creating files on everybody?
I feel like he probably always knew. I feel like it wasn't long after the events that he knew. And again, I feel like it probably manifested initially with those files, how I would take out the Justice League. And that, of course, leads to Tower of Babel. And then I feel like there's this escalation and eventually leads to Brother Eye and all that business. But yeah, as far as them doing that to him, again, like it's easy to look at what he's done since. And it's like, of course, he doesn't have a leg to stand on. But in that context, but I don't know. It's like it would have, as he says in Crisis of Conscience, like I would have stopped you.
Mm-hmm.
And what would that have looked like? What would that have meant for the Justice League? Would there have been a Justice League?
And they talk about that. Who's left?
Yeah. As
people are now walking away at the end of this story arc in JLA, like, don't forget Batman at the very beginning of the Morrison Porter runs. Like, it took a lot to convince him to be part of the League in the first place. Like, he didn't want to be sharing. He didn't want to be on he's like, I work alone. If you want me, I'll be here, but I don't need to be part of this League. And then he caves and does. So, but now he's going, no, I'm out. We're done.
Yeah.
And they all do, except for, I think, John and who's left, because they're looking at the new recruits.
Yeah, it's Martian Manhunter, John Stewart, Superman, and I don't know, one other. But it's very, very, very thin ranks at that point. Yeah. But again, I think it's a valid... You get both sides of the debate with respect to both the villains and to Batman. With the Superman of it all, it doesn't seem like Superman ever knew what they did to Batman.
Oh,
it doesn't seem that way because Superman even says in Crisis of Conscience, like, Batman told me what you did to him.
Yeah.
So I feel like we're getting
into about the first one. Yeah.
I feel like we're getting into Friends territory here of like, he doesn't know they know we know. It's like, a little bit of that.
Yeah.
But then it's like, how could he not know?
Right.
Or,
Well, and how he reacts is interesting because Clark and Bruce of all of them are probably the tightest. and they have the longest history, and they have had to trust each other for a long time. So yeah, I mean, Superman would probably take it the hardest if why'd you do this to him? You knew he probably would have told you the right answer because he always has the right answer.
But yeah, that's Identity Crisis. There was one moment that I just loved. That's not really related to the mystery or anything, but it was from the moment I read it to now when Ollie summons Hal, who's now the Spectre.
It's so nice. That whole scene.
It's great because look, and I've gone on record and I will remain on record. Yeah. I didn't have the attachment to Hal Jordan as Green Lantern. I only knew his downfall and then redemption, and I thought it was a really interesting
It's a well-done arc.
And I liked him as the Spectre.
Yeah.
And when you get scenes like this with him and Ollie, or with him and Wally in the Flash book, and he's the one who restores Wally's secret identity, which, and the Johns Flash book dealt with this too, where we just had all this business where Spectre erased the world's knowledge that Wally West is the Flash. So, that's the other thing. It's like multiple heroes have engaged in this mind wiping in some way, shape, or form. But in any event, but yeah, the scene with Hal, where I loved it because it made total sense that Ollie would ask for help. He's like, "Don't you know who did this?" He's like, I can't tell you.
Can't. Yeah.
But that last page when he's like, "So Hal, when are you coming back?" He's like, "I don't know what you mean." He goes, "You know. When are you really coming back?"
And then
I'm working on it. Oh.
And then, yeah,
it was great. I love.
And
that
he's coming back now. Like when you look at now what we know.
Yeah, but what's funny is at the time there hadn't announced rebirth. Yeah, no,
there's no plans yet.
Yeah, that was cool. I remember.
But clearly Johns must have known. Like he's
I think they were. I'm sure they were on the road to that. But it was just this cool thing because. And I think this speaks to how cool that moment was, because even not having that attachment to the character, when he says that, it's like, oh, all right, like here we go.
Yeah. And it's just sweet. I think that's how I would categorize it. It's a sweet friendship moment when they get to talk. Yeah.
It's cool stuff. Even just in that opening issue, you have the Lex Luthor, the green battlesuit being sold on the black market. Yeah. There's so much stuff where it really does feel like this love letter to the DC universe. It feels like this is coming from someone who, and it is, right? He grew up with these characters and has probably thought about a lot of these things or asked these questions and now has the opportunity to explore them. And so again, in that aspect, there's some great material here.
And some really interesting misdirects. Like where you're like, why is that there? Wait, what does this mean? Wait, this person is back. Who's this person? Like, I think that they did a good job of bringing some characters kind of out of the woodwork that we don't usually get to talk about, which was cool. And you see, like you said, the behind the scenes.
Yeah. Again, I guess the last question, unless there's anything else you want to talk about, just as far as the tone that this set for the years to come. I mean,
it did.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess, how do you feel about that tone? Or did you enjoy it at the time? Do you feel like, hey, maybe they took it too far? And I guess either way, how much responsibility is fair to put on Identity Crisis? Because ultimately, what happens after it is up to other people, right?
I mean, I don't know if we could blame Identity Crisis solely. But I mean, a lot of what's happening at this time frame in DC is shifting again with Maxwell Lord, with all of that. We're shifting into an era where death is going to happen very differently than the death of Superman in 1993. Like it's not a big creature. No, humanity kills somebody, or heroes' flaws kill people. Those kind of things. It did set the tone for, again, like Flashpoint coming and all these hard stories. Like, oh, I didn't expect to see that character do that. So I wouldn't blame Identity Crisis, but it was definitely part of an era that I think we still see it today. I think we're still seeing those consequences coming from this. I don't know if, again, like I said at the very beginning, would I suggest this spell, like put it in my daughter's lap right now? No. But I think if she said, like, what run should I read? Like, what was a really cool time in DC's shift of tone? Well, I'd say, yeah, you probably start with this era and you'll understand more about what we might be seeing coming soon in movies.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think, I clearly, especially what we've now learned about the conception of this event,
right?
It's like they were headed in this direction and this was the tone they wanted.
No matter what.
This was how it manifested at the beginning. But
I don't
think
like
we were
how
getting
they
there
approached
anyway.
it at all, especially if there's truth to that. I don't like how quippy they use that topic. But I think they were going to change that direction no matter how they did it. Even if they just flat out murdered Sue without even including the rape. I think they needed to figure out how do they include the mind wipe identity vibe.
Look, contrary to what Meltzer said, I genuinely believe if the story were to be approached now, I do think we would see it unfold differently in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
I mean, number one, with the exception of the assistant editor who we've quoted, there are no women involved in the production of this story, right?
No.
And again, I think that between that and the fact that we're looking 20 years ago and just the attitude that clearly was going on behind the scenes that led to this, it's not surprising necessarily that the perspective we get is what we see in this story. On a positive note, one of the other things that I really did like, and this is a theme that builds out of the Archer's Quest as well, this notion that after Superman died, the DC universe got their act together, got organized, right? Because there's that whole bit in the Archer's Quest where he had enlisted the Shade, right, to take care of these items for him, right? That whole thing. And similarly here too, it's like the universe, our cast of characters here, they have their protocols, they have their list of people to notify.
Who do they see? It's like a phone tree.
Yeah. Batman examines the scene, but then Ollie brings in Mr. Miracle and the Metal Men and Ray. And then the next time after Jean's alleged attack, of course, goes straight to the top, goes to Superman.
And that's interesting too, when Owen shows up at the scene and even the feds are like, why is Batman here? The feds are like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
They're like, he's right there. I don't think you understand what you're seeing.
Yeah.
It's like, they're even saying like, no, there's a way this is going to get done. There are two things I learned about Brad Meltzer that I didn't know ahead of time that I think is kind of interesting that are related to Superman. So I don't know if you saw the trivia about him a little bit, but like, have you read or know about this Book of Lies book that he wrote?
I've not read it. I know just very, very generally.
Yeah. So it's related to like somehow it connects the murders of Cain to Mitchell Siegel, the father of Jerry Siegel, which is an odd like thought processes. But then clearly he's also a pretty big Superman fan. Like he actually is the person that helped preserve the Cleveland house.
Oh.
So like it said he ran an auction that raised over $100,000 to help create the society for Siegel and Schuster and made sure the Cleveland house was taken care of. So it's just kind of interesting that like he was clearly a supporter of the Superman legacy, which was interesting.
Yeah. No, I look, I guess the last thing I'll say on that side of it is I think whatever shortcomings, limitations there are in the story, and there are, I mean, yes, we look at the execution of it, but again, I think if that background is to be believed, it's like, he was tasked with this, and it's like one way or the other we were going to get it.
I got to do it.
At least it was in the hands of someone who tried to do something with it. But again, I still think.
And he's dealt with, like, if you look at his novels, he's dealt with hard, gritty material and topics. So they're probably thinking, well, if somebody's going to do this, let's have this guy do it. If they had that, which again, we don't agree with, but at least they gave it to somebody who could do it. It seems in a more appropriate way.
All I know is at this point, after rereading it and reading the tie-ins and reading the background stuff and having this conversation, I can genuinely say I have the clearest sense of what this work is.
Right.
Both positively and negatively.
And I can respect it.
Yeah.
But have disagreements with it too.
Yeah, absolutely. So audience, I'm curious to know where you land on this. Again, like I said, I trust the audience that, they kind of know where we're coming from and what we're trying to do and acknowledging it for what it is. And
well, then more than any other episode, I almost am curious when you post this on Facebook, not that we love like the comment threads, like, the downfall of Facebook is people that just go off the deep end. This would be a valuable place to place thoughts and questions and where are we on this, Mark?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I genuinely, and again, I trust people to be respectful and and all that stuff. But yeah, I mean, look, one way or the other, this is a This is a critical piece of DC's publishing history, especially this era, and in the context of these crisis events, because now we're heading into Infinite Crisis territory. So I thank you very much for doing this homework and for coming over here and having this conversation.
Man,
it was really
great.
a lot of fun.
Yeah.
The material was difficult, but the conversation was a lot of fun.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah.
I think we hit on just about everything. I'm sure after we finish, we'll be like, I should talk about this. But I really think we hit on the most salient points with respect to this. And it's certainly a book that's been discussed and written about plenty.
Yeah.
So I'm glad, I'm happy with the course our conversation took.
And I would encourage, if you have read the book, like I said, I'm not going to put it in the lap of my daughter necessarily, like you gotta, but I think if you have read it, reread it and see if you're along the same lines that we're looking at stuff.
Absolutely. Well, I thank you very much. Very much. Thank you for joining me for this episode.
Yeah.
Audience, I always appreciate you tuning in. So this was chapter 4. Next time, like I said, we'll be getting into our countdown to Infinite Crisis, and then the episode after that, Infinite Crisis itself. I've enjoyed all of the episodes so far, Crisis on Multiple Earths, on Infinite Earths, and 0 Hour, but this now, from this episode forward to a point, this is the sweet spot for me. These are the events that I was there for and I was reading as they were coming out. We'll then get past that point in this event when we get to stuff like metal and death metal and all that stuff.
And reading these as adults too. Like these are now books that you're going to be reading as a college into adult.
Exactly. So make sure you keep tuning in. We'll be back next week with chapter 5. And of course, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.